gone from European exchanges, not because of a hack, not because of a market crash, because of a law. And here is the part that almost nobody is connecting right now, that money does not just vanish. Liquidity does not evaporate. It moves. It finds a new home. And if you understand what is happening in the regulatory layer being built right now, underneath all the noise, you can start to see exactly where it is heading. Tether, the $186 billion giant that basically eyes crypto liquidity in this market, is being pushed off every major regulated exchange in Europe. And Tether looked at the rules they were given and said, no, we're not doing that. That decision created a vacuum the size of a small country's GDP. And Ripple has been building for exactly this moment. If you have been watching XRP for a while and you feel like something big is quietly happening, but you cannot quite put your finger on it, this video is for you. Stay with me. Welcome back. I'm not going to tell you XRP is going to hit some magical number or that you're going to get rich by Friday. That's not what we do here. What we do is read the actual structure being built beneath the market noise and tell you what we see clearly and without the hype. Today, we are covering Tether's MiCA delisting in Europe, the Genius Act moving in the United States, what RLUSD's current numbers are quietly telling us, and why the regulatory moment we are in right now could reshape stablecoin power completely. Let's get into it. Here's the thing most retail investors do not understand about what is happening in Europe right now. MiCA is not a ban on crypto. Let me be very clear about that. MiCA, which stands for Markets in Crypto Assets, is a regulatory architecture. It is a set of rules that says if you want to offer a stablecoin to EU citizens through a licensed exchange, your stablecoin issuer must be authorized as an e-money institution inside the European Union. That's it. That's the rule. Obtain the authorization, get on the ESMA register, and your stablecoin can be listed. Skip that step, and no MiCA licensed venue can legally touch your product. Tether could have applied for that authorization. They chose not to. Their official position is that MiCA's reserve structure and governance requirements conflict with how Tether actually operates. And I actually understand that from a business logic standpoint. Tether is not a small operation. Restructuring an entire $186 billion product to comply with a single regional framework is a genuinely massive ask. But here's the thing about regulatory frameworks. They do not care about your business model. They care about compliance. And if you choose not to comply, the framework simply proceeds without you. MiCA's stablecoin rules started applying in 2025. By 2026, they are fully live. And because Tether chose not to pursue EU authorization, every major MiCA licensed exchange in the European Economic Area started delisting or restricting USDT pairs for EU clients, not because they dislike Tether, because they cannot list a non-authorized token without putting their own licenses at risk. Coinbase EU, Kraken EU, Binance EU, Crypto.com, Bitstamp, these are not small niche platforms. These are the on-ramps that millions of Europeans use to access this market. CoinMetro just announced that starting June 25th, every single USDT pair they operate is being migrated to USDG. When you see the list of what that covers, XRP, ADA, XLM, Bitcoin, Ethereum, basically the entire market, you start to understand the actual scale of what is being removed from EU accessible liquidity. The most traded assets are getting a slightly longer runway, but they are all going. Now, EU users can still hold USDT in self-custody. They can use it on DeFi. Nobody is taking their Tether. But if you want to trade on a regulated, licensed, insured exchange in Europe, Tether is increasingly not an option. That is the vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. So does financial liquidity. The question is, what fills it? Right now, the two stablecoins that actually fit inside the MiCA architecture are USDC and RLUSD. USDC is already moving fast to capture this opportunity, but RLUSD is doing something slightly different and, in my view, potentially more important for the long run, because RLUSD was not built to just capture market share. It was built to be the dollar instrument that plugs directly into the regulatory infrastructure being constructed simultaneously in both the EU and the United States. That's a very specific design choice. And it's starting to show up in the data. Let's talk numbers, actual numbers, not vibes. Tether's current market cap is $186.28 billion. It is the largest stablecoin on Earth by a substantial margin. Of that total, roughly $17.5 billion was accessible through EU regulated exchanges. That's the figure being delisted. That's the liquidity that EU traders now need to replace with something that actually fits the framework. $17.5 billion. For context, that is larger than the GDP of Iceland. That is more than the market cap of most companies in the S&P 500. That is a real substantial pool of liquidity looking for a new home. Now, here is where it gets interesting. RLUSD currently sits at $772 million on the XRP ledger alone, not counting Ethereum. And that number grew 62% in just the last 30 days, not the last year, 30 days. Something is happening with our LUSD demand right now that is not being discussed loudly in the mainstream crypto conversation. That kind of growth does not happen randomly. It is institutional allocation. It is quietly moving dollars into an instrument they expect to matter. Let me give you a simple way to think about the opportunity size here. If RLUSD captures 10% of the EU stablecoin liquidity that Tether is vacating, you are looking at $1.75 billion. If it captures 20%, that is $3.5 billion. If it gets full MiCA authorization, which requires appearing on the ESMA MiCA register, and it starts getting listed on the major EU exchanges that are now scrambling for compliant stablecoin pairs, the current $772 million would look like a rounding error in the rearview mirror. That is not a prediction. That is just arithmetic. The market has to go somewhere. Now, I want to be direct about something. RLUSD is not MiCA authorized yet. As of May and June 2026, it does not appear on the ESMA MiCA register. EU regulated exchanges cannot currently offer it to retail EU clients. Ripple has to complete the authorization process first. This is not done. But here is what I keep coming back to. Ripple already secured an electronic money institution license in Luxembourg. They have been deliberately building their EU regulatory stack for years. The RLUSD white paper was structured specifically as a MiCA e-money token path, not retrofitted after the fact. This was designed for this moment. Compare that to Tether. Tether has been operating since 2014 with no U.S. banking charter, no EU authorization, and reserves that at various points included Bitcoin and other non-cash assets. And they are now launching a completely separate stablecoin called UST, specifically engineered to comply with the U.S. Genius Act framework. Stop and think about that. Tether, the entity that controls $186 billion, cannot make its existing product fit the regulatory box. It has to build a new one from scratch. That tells you everything you need to know about where USDT stands relative to the world being constructed around it. Let's talk about what the serious regulated players are actually doing right now, because this matters a lot. In the United States, the Federal Register just published a proposed joint rulemaking that covers payment stablecoin issuers under the Bank Secrecy Act. The agencies on this are FinCEN, OCC, the Federal Reserve Board, FDIC, and NCUA. All of them aligned, moving together. What does that mean practically? It means stablecoin issuers are now being treated like financial institutions, full KYC. Customer identification programs, anti-money laundering controls, sanctions compliance, and the technical ability to freeze and burn tokens under lawful court orders. This is the Genius Act being implemented, and it is not optional. RLUSD was issued under a New York Department of Financial Services trust charter. It already meets these requirements structurally. Ripple did not have to re-architect anything. USDT does not automatically fit this framework. The Genius Act explicitly prefers tokens issued by U.S. licensed banks or trust companies with full U.S. regulatory oversight. That description is USDC. That description is RLUSD. It is not the legacy USDT that we have all been using as a trading pair for the last decade. Back in Europe, look at what is happening on the exchange side. Binance's MiCA license application in Greece is expected to be rejected. OKX delisted Tether pairs in Europe months before they had to, not because of enforcement pressure at that exact moment, but because they read the direction of travel and made the proactive compliance call. Now, here's the number that genuinely should stop you in your tracks. Before MiCA, there were somewhere between 2,700 and 3,000 crypto businesses operating in Europe. After full MiCA enforcement, only 250 have received authorization so far, 250 out of 3,000. That is not a minor compliance hurdle. That is a structural reset of who gets to operate inside the European digital asset market. The companies and the stablecoins that survive this filter will own this space for the next decade. And Ripple has been building its European regulatory presence since before most people even knew MiCA existed. Also worth noticing, RLUSD is already live on Kraken, Bitstamp, and LMAX, among others. Ripple is not waiting to get MiCA authorization before expanding exchange presence. They are building the network now. The EU listing will be the final regulatory unlock, not the starting point. Here is what I am personally watching in order. First, the ESMA MiCA register. This is the most important thing to monitor if you care about RLUSD in the EU. The day RLUSD appears on that register as an authorized e-money token is the day EU-regulated exchanges can legally list it for retail clients. I am watching that register. When it changes, it will be a real story, and I suspect the market will notice quickly. Second, Genius Act rulemaking progress. The Federal Register notice is still in proposed rulemaking. It will go through public comment. But the machine is in motion. July is going to be a significant month for U.S. stablecoin regulatory clarity. When the rule finalizes, it puts structural pressure on non-compliant dollar stablecoins operating in U.S. markets. That pressure is not going away. Third, Tether's UST launch and what happens to USDT volume after it. If Tether's own compliance-focused product draws institutional flow away from legacy USDT, you will see it in the supply and volume numbers. Tether building a competitor to itself is the single clearest signal that the regulatory era for stablecoins is real and irreversible. Fourth, RLUSD on-chain volume. The 62% growth in 30 days on the XRP ledger is a data point. If that pace continues or even holds, you are watching a genuine demand shift, not a marketing blip. Track the month-over-month figure. It will tell you whether this is real institutional flow or noise. Fifth, Binance EU's regulatory outcome. If Binance loses its EU license, that reshuffles the European exchange landscape significantly. For MiCA-compliant assets and issuers, that outcome could actually be favorable. The vacuum does not shrink. It grows. I want to say something honest. This story is not trending right now. It is not the hot take of the week. Most retail investors are not sitting around discussing regulatory e-money token frameworks in Brussels. And I completely understand that. It is not exactly an exciting headline. But the boring regulatory stories are usually the ones that matter the most by the time everyone else notices. By the time RLUSD lands on the ESMA register, by the time the EU listings start, by the time the mainstream crypto media connects all of these dots in one headline, you will not be early anymore. The window to understand this clearly and think about it rationally is right now, while the room is quiet. And I want to address the bigger picture here because I think it matters. The XRP ledger is financial infrastructure. RLUSD is the dollar instrument designed to run through that infrastructure. When a regulated European bank or payment corridor needs to move dollars across borders through a MiCA compliant, Genius Act compliant, NYDFS regulated pipeline, what does that look like? I think you are watching it get built right now. This is not the story the algorithm is rewarding today, but the story the algorithm rewards tomorrow was always being written today. Let's bring this full circle. $17.5 billion in Tether liquidity was just removed from European regulated exchanges. The largest stablecoin in the world is building a separate, new product because its original cannot fit the regulatory frameworks being built in both the EU and the United States. Europe has gone from roughly 3,000 crypto operators to 250 approved firms under MiCA. The Genius Act is putting full bank-level compliance requirements on U.S. payment stablecoin issuers, and RLUSD just grew 62% in 30 days, while most people were looking in a completely different direction. These are not isolated events. They are connected, and the connection runs through a company that spent years building regulatory relationships, trust charters, and e-money institution licenses before most people knew what MiCA was. I am watching the ESMA register. I am watching the Genius Act rulemaking. I am watching RLUSD's volume every single month, not because this is guaranteed. Nothing in markets is guaranteed, but because this is what evidence-based thinking looks like in a moment when most people are still reacting to price candles. The regulatory infrastructure for digital assets is being written right now. The question worth asking is not whether you believe in crypto. The question is whether the assets you hold were built to survive the world being built around them. History does not reward the loudest voice in the room. It rewards the person who was paying attention when the room was still quiet. Comment vacuum below if this hit different today. Like if you want me to keep tracking this story as it develops. And subscribe if you actually want analysis instead of price cheerleading. I'll see you next time.